Welcome to Pure Nonfiction, the podcast interviewing documentary filmmakers. I'm Tom Powers, the documentary programmer for the Toronto International Film Festival and artistic director of Doc NYC. On this episode, I talked to Dawn Porter about her four-part series, Bobby Kennedy for President, on Netflix. Dawn was a previous guest on this podcast on episode 2. She was talking about her films Gideon's Army, about public defenders in the South, and Trapped, about state restrictions on abortion. The theme of racial injustice runs throughout her work, and it's central to her take on Robert Kennedy. During his days as a campaign manager for John F. Kennedy, then as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy had to deal with civil rights as a prominent issue, but it often took second priority to appeasing white voters in the South. After JFK's assassination, Robert took a deeper interest in America's poor and issues of race. Dawn's film shows him touring the Mississippi Delta in 1967 with a reporter.
Senator, what do you make of the problem of poverty in this, our poorest state?
I think that considering we have a gross national product of some $700 billion and that we spend $75 billion on armaments, you would think that we could be doing more for those who are poor, and particularly for our children who had nothing to do with being born into this world, but who don't have enough to eat. And what we have here, of course, is a considerable amount of hunger. We have the children with distended stomachs. And the fact is that we're not doing what we should be doing in this country to deal with this problem.
Bobby Kennedy for President traces his political growth, first as a U.S. Senator, then in his 1968 campaign for the Democratic primary that was cut short by an assassin's bullet on June 6th. The final episode in the series revisits questions about the murder that have stirred conspiracy theories for 50 years. I asked Dawn what Robert Kennedy meant to her before she started this project.
I think I knew Robert Kennedy as a man in history books, but also on my grandmother's wall.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bobby Kennedy was really important to Black people. And my grandmother had a picture of the Kennedy brothers on the wall in her apartment. And, when you're a kid, you don't think about why your parents or your grandparents have pictures on the wall. But, starting to do this project, I came back to that. Like, what would make... There wasn't a picture of me on the wall. So who is this white guy? But I think he was more of a, kind of like Hamilton before Hamilton, like kind of somebody you kind of know things about. And then as we got into it, I just, not only learned so much, but really started to feel what it was like to create a leader. And how he evolved as a politician and a person was what interested me. But particularly his interactions with the Black community were really interesting to me, and watching how they evolved over time.
Robert Kennedy famously signed warrants to wiretap.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King in 1962, then again in 1963, under a lot of pressure from J. Edgar Hoover.
But he did it.
But he did it, and I'm interested to know what you make of that chapter of his life.
So, and that's where, that's something I don't love that he did it, but I love that it shows the complexity of his life, his personal opinions, his public and political opinions. He was, he came out of a strong anti-communist, political background where he, was like communism was evil number one. And, I think that worldview.
You see that in his targeting of Castro, and you see that in the beginnings of the Vietnam War. And
during, McCarthy hearings when he's counsel to that committee. So that background is hard to shed, and, Hoover, there's a lot of pressure in saying that, King was like in league with the communists. But, you back up where King is arrested early on and sentenced to hard labor, sentenced to like chain gang for sitting in at a lunch counter during JFK's campaign. And JFK, there was debate about whether JFK should even call Coretta Scott, King. And Bobby was against it. He was like, if you look like you're aligning with the Kennedys, we will lose the southern states.
This is 1960.
This is the 1960
during
campaign.
JFK's campaign.
And so, JFK, Bobby's like kind of out of the room. And, JFK decides with another advisor that he's going to just call her and say, I hope he's okay. That's all he did. Bobby Kennedy's furious about this, says, you've lost the election. This is not going to be forgiven that you did this. But then he thinks overnight, and he's so, angry that King is being held in this prison that he then calls the prison. And he's directly credited with saving MLK's life. People thought that King was going to be murdered that night. So that footage of him coming out is some of the footage that has not really been seen before. And you see at that time that, what the Kennedy brothers couldn't have understood was that Harry Belafonte, kind of gives the okay to support JFK, says to the black people, yes, we should support him. Harry Belafonte then makes this famous commercial where he says, I'm supporting JFK. Black vote comes out, tremendously for
Jackie
Kennedy.
Robinson was supporting
Jackie
Richard.
Robinson had defected and was supporting the Republicans. Jackie Robinson felt the Democrats were not helping. And they were not. They were not strong enough. And that's kind of the point, is that they were not strong enough. But Kennedy didn't do it for political reasons. He actually thought that it was going to be the death of the campaign. So it turns out to not only not be the death, but actually maybe to even have delivered that election. But then you see, a few years later, he signs that warrant. So his evolution was not complete.
Mm-hmm.
He did not spring. Neither Kennedy brother was like springing fully formed into a civil rights champion. They had to be urged and pushed. That was a conversation that happened over many years. And I feel like that's something that this series can add to, the understanding of.
So as I understand it, the way this whole project got started was not about Bobby Kennedy's life, but about his death. Someone came to you because they had unique access to Sirhan's legal team, who were very motivated to revisit the very questionable circumstances around Bobby Kennedy's death. So from that starting point, you crafted this 4-part series. It's largely about Bobby Kennedy's life. And then the last episode, you dig into the questions about his death.
Right.
And a big figure is Paul Schrade. Can you talk about who Paul Schrade is?
Yeah. So we were approached by a team who was interested, was working with Paul Schrade, and they were interested because I had done Gideon's Army. They thought, you're interested in the rights of the accused. Sirhan is still alive. He's in prison in California. He's been denied parole. And one thing people should understand is the standard for denying people parole is whether you are a danger to the community. So if you look at that standard, 70-something-year-old Sirhan, is he really a danger to the community? That's supposed to be the standard. And yet every time he comes up for parole, the question is, this was a really terrible crime, and have you taken responsibility for the crime? That's not the legal standard. So, we should either change the standard or we should apply it. You could question the standard, but you should apply it fairly. So I was interested in that, but I'm not a conspiracy person. So what I did is I hired an investigative journalist, and Lauren Capps. She's fantastic. She's done like Frontlines and Fault Lines and all of those. She's Nancy Drew, girl detective. Mm-hmm. So I was like, go to the original files. She went to the LA Police Department. She went through all these files. We have like all of these books, including 8 binders that are a full transcript of the Sirhan trial. Mm-hmm. And, we could not find evidence of a second gun. That's not, I would love to have been the person that could finally prove this, but that's not what we found. But what I did find was that his trial was not what you would want for anyone that you loved. So to me, a few reviews have she believes there was a second gun. I don't necessarily believe there was a second gun. I believe Sirhan's trial was not what one would want out of a just criminal justice system, and I think that is ironic and too bad. Break
down that for me. Like, what are the things that you find most wanting about his trial?
Well, his lawyers, despite the fact that there's something like 8 witnesses who saw a girl with a polka dot dress and a man with her, and who said, we shot him. And one person saw 3 people come in and 2 people come out, including this polka dot dress girl and her companion. One of those is a woman named Sandra Serrano. We found her. We interviewed her. She has the same story she's always had. She has no reason whatsoever to make this story up. She's not before or since. She was on the stairs with these people, came out and said, we shot him, and they, ran away. This other couple saw them. So there's that.
Which is also cockamamie, because if you had shot
why
him,
would you
why
say
would
that?
You be broadcasting
but you're like, crazy people. But so but it's there,
yes.
And people should at least ask her about it. The way she was treated was terrible. It's not like people who were asking her. But, the best evidence
So she never came up in the trial, for instance. Sirhan's defense lawyers were never making a strong effort to point towards
anything else.
Any collaborators. So
the other thing, and now I'm going to sound like I'm a second gun theory, but I think the strongest evidence was there was a coroner, Dr. Noguchi, and he said that the bullet entered JFK's head at a few inches away. Nobody places Sirhan at a few inches away. So there's all these questions about bullets and XYZ. So the point isn't whether or not these things are true. It's that they weren't brought up in the trial because Sirhan's defense lawyer stipulated to his guilt. So, like, if you're on trial for murder and there's all these, there's ballistics evidence that wasn't tested, there's witnesses who weren't cross-examined, and there's a coroner saying that the way that the bullet went in doesn't match the guy who was arrested for it, at the very least, you would bring that up. Mm-hmm. And none of this was brought up. So, he had no real defense. So that's the issue I have with the trial, is because what that does is it means people don't believe the verdict. And that opens the way for all these conspiracy theories to fester. And we don't feel satisfied. So I thought that was interesting. To see. I also was interested in, his brother, his family, there was, he was an Arab, he was a Jordanian citizen. So there's a little bit of that happening. He's described as a swarthy assailant and that kind of thing. So, we're still talking about the same kinds of issues like in that Sirhan trial as we are talking about today. So I just thought it was interesting. I do not believe that there is evidence of a second gunman. So I just want to make that clear.
So brings me back to Paul Schrade.
Yes.
Paul Schrade
Which was your question.
was a union organizer who was with Bobby Kennedy that night, was hit by one of the bullets, thought that he might have been killed, but he wasn't. And today, he remains obsessed, if that's not too strong a word, about what happened.
Fair. Yeah. Paul Schrade is convinced that there was a second gunman. And Paul, was grievously injured. He was the first person shot that night. He had been working with Bob and Kennedy. He's one of the people that introduced Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to Bobby Kennedy and really encouraged him and pushed him to, go out, walk picket lines with them. Bobby Kennedy very famously breaks Cesar Chavez's last fast. So Paul is, a smart and lovely and committed activist, I thought it was interesting it was interesting to see Bobby Kennedy through Paul's eyes. Paul was kind of a first-hand witness to so much of the organizing, and organizing was really important then. And, I'm kind of like a politics junkie. I like seeing how the sausage is made. So Paul gives us kind of a window into that. And then also a window into post-Kennedy's death, kind of how does that legacy live on? I mean, in addition to having concerns about the trial, Paul is the person who fought for decades in order to open a Robert F. Kennedy School, which exists now on the site of the Ambassador Hotel. It originally was a Trump property, and which is kind of like a funny, very satisfying detail.
Irony. And so Paul Schrade remains committed to trying to figure out what happened that night, since he doesn't accept the official record. To what extent does he have any interaction with the Kennedy family? How do they regard that?
He's such a good person, and he was, close with RFK. So he is in touch with Kathleen Kennedy, with Carrie Kennedy. I think Rory knows him. I mean, I know Rory. He's definitely in touch with Bobby Jr. So he has, Ethel Kennedy sent him a bust of RFK after the funeral. So I can't speak for the family, but what I think is Paul was such a dedicated aide that he's almost like an extended family person. He's not some Johnny-come-lately who with a, conspiracy theory. He has his interest in the case is because he thinks it's justice for his friend Bob. So I think that they are quite compassionate about they understand how much he deeply loved RFK. I mean, it really, almost ruined his life. He went to a deep depression. He really suffered after his death.
When we think about Robert Kennedy and his achievements, I think a lot of what comes to the foreground are symbolic moments when he's breaking the fast with Cesar Chavez, when he's giving a speech in South Africa about segregation, when he's giving a speech to a black crowd on the night that Martin Luther King has been assassinated. And those are powerful moments that I think do have meaning, but it's different than being active as a politician to do something, to create legislation, which I feel there's less of in his career.
Right.
I mean, is that fair to say?
Once he was elected to the Senate, he was a really effective senator for New York. I mean, he used, kind of he had a national platform. So he was certainly one of those people who was interested in, international relations as well as national issues, of which there were many. But, doing things like he was really active on fair housing committees, on Native American rights, which we don't even get into. And he was extremely, interested and did a lot of work on that. I can't give you a bill count. I wish I could. I think
Well, there's one project that you do bring up, which is this project he initiated in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a neighborhood of Brooklyn.
Yeah.
I congratulate the people of Bedford-Stuyvesant. We've been distressed by the divisions that have taken place in the United States between blacks and whites. The fact is that we can work together. The fact is that we can make a better society. And the fact is that we will, and we'll have a better America for the next generation of Americans. Thank you very much.
Can you explain what that was and what you think the legacy of that project is?
So Bedford-Stuyvesant was a neighborhood, lower-income neighborhood, mostly minority neighborhood in Brooklyn. And at the time in the 60s, it was really economically depressed, a lot of unemployment, really challenged neighborhood. And Kennedy felt that if they could kind of turn around Bed-Stuy, if they could bring jobs into that neighborhood and bring some of the wealth of New York City into that economically depressed area, that could possibly be a model for the rest of the country. So he worked really, really hard to bring the downtown New York City bankers to get them to invest in Brooklyn. And he used all of his political capital and his political strength in order to corral New Yorkers. But he did something else. He hired a black man, Franklin Thomas, who would go on to become president of the Ford Foundation. And he said, Frank is in charge. And there's one thing we cut out, but This is the 1960s. There's a young 30-something-year-old black man who's in charge. People were responding because it was Bobby Kennedy, and they were answering the call. And they're at some local meeting, and somebody says, okay, and we'll get, speaking to Bobby, he says, we'll get back to you. And he says, you don't get back to me. Frank's in charge. Frank is the person in charge. And Frank Thomas told me that every time Bobby was in New York, he always, no entourage, no big deal. He always went to Brooklyn and met with Frank, and they went carefully over exactly what was happening in Bed-Stuy. And I think that does, say something about him. He wasn't just, bringing his famous face to things. He really, and Bedford-Stuyvesant program exists to this day, and there are Kennedys who are on the board of it. It did.
How is it active today? What does it do today?
So it's an economic development, it's like one of those community investment things. So you can get grants, from it. So Bobby Kennedy got a plant to open. There was an economic empowerment thing where people got actual jobs. He also realized that having like a beautification program, and this was like Frank Thomas too. So like if people's houses look nice, that like it gives you certain pride. There was a lot of black ownership in that neighborhood, and he and Frank Thomas talked about this a lot. You want to encourage black ownership. So, Frank Thomas was just another person who said, he just was, he was solid. He was consistent. He wasn't a person who was using things for, camera ops. So I was like, it was a very impressive. Frank Thomas is a lovely man who's in his, 80s now. And, just could recall all of these stories. But how important it was to him to be recognized by somebody that important. He recognized how important it was for Bobby Kennedy to come out to Brooklyn. He didn't summon him downtown.
We're talking about all these truly wonderful qualities about Bobby Kennedy. He's also a figure of his time. He had what seems to be a kind of nasty streak of homophobia towards Bayard Rustin. He was
not so great on women's rights either.
Right.
Not a lot of women, in, I think we have to acknowledge that, I don't think it's enough to excuse to say he's a man of his time, because he certainly could have hired some girls.
Mm-hmm. And that's what he called them too.
Right. So, there's still some growth. I mean, the one.
So I wonder how you grapple with that as a biographer.
For me, I think, one thing that was difficult was I really wanted to have first person interviews, people who were there. I didn't want to have biographers and historians who were looking back. So you kind of sacrifice a little bit of context because his critics, Neil Gallagher, who was the congressman at the time, probably wasn't so concerned about Bobby Kennedy's, not being so great on women. So you and people are dying. People are, there's not that first person.
Well, Marion Wright Edelman is one person who stands out to me as, being frank, that she didn't have a good early opinion of Robert Kennedy. In fact, I'm not quite sure what to make of what she says. The two things that she points to are him serving on Joseph McCarthy's committee, and she also refers to him wiretapping Martin Luther King. But I'm not sure that she could have known that at the time that she's talking about, because I don't think that really came out until during his campaign in '68, as I understand the history.
The black community believed very strongly that they were being taped. I mean, I've told you before, my great grandfather is Ben Robeson, my brother of Paul Robeson, and so during that time, everybody felt like they were being wiretapped. So she may not have known it to be a fact in the papers.
I see.
But I am 100% positive. And I know this because
she would have blamed the Attorney General of the United States
for authorizing. Everybody knew what Hoover was interested in. I can remember my grandmother said she used to have like people like Harry Belafonte and Paul Robeson, other people in her apartment because they figured it wouldn't be tapped. So they could meet at her place because it was, they would find safe places to meet. So that's my guess. I didn't ask her that, but that's my guess.
Oh, that makes sense.
But film is not a book report, right? So I think what you want to try and do is not be so romantic that you give a misimpression. And you want to have some voices, that kind of point to you can't, even just for film reasons, you can't appreciate growth unless you know where somebody's begun. So, that I think it's important to try and at least give nods to, it's not a commercial.
Something that always makes me approach this history warily is that there is a kind of what-if quality to it. What if Martin Luther King wasn't assassinated? What if Bobby Kennedy wasn't assassinated? And I'm not sure what to do with that, because the fact is they were. And also, if Bobby Kennedy wasn't assassinated, we don't know that he would have become president in 1968.
And we don't know what he would have done.
Yeah.
Right. Even King, who knows, what the future would have held. I do think, though, that the exercise of imagining, about a world with Bobby Kennedy rather than without it is a worthwhile one. And that's because we shouldn't just take what's given to us. We should actually think about, because what you do during that exercise is you imagine, you deeply think about the political understandings and the political proclivities of these people, and you imagine how they should play out. So rather than just watching democracy happen, that means you're thinking about it. You're thinking about what would a Kennedy administration, how could that have been different from a Nixon administration? The other thing is you certainly see people are so despondent, and you see the convention of 1968 is just a holy mess. I mean, it is so violent, and the protests and the riots, we certainly know that wouldn't have happened, right? So, what if is, I'm kind of with you in the what if is frustrating. But I think if it causes you to more deeply consider what came before, that probably is worthwhile. That's worth doing.
Or maybe that we don't have to settle for what we have.
We don't have to settle for what we have. And we have to be part of what we're going to get. You can't just count on somebody else to save you. You've actually got to continue to participate. The other thing is it took a long time, but we did recover from that tumultuous time. And, I think many people are feeling like pulling the covers over their heads still today. And that's just really not an option. I mean, what if people had pulled the covers over their heads, in the 1960s? The fact that I'm sitting here, the fact that I can do this job as a Black woman, how much slower would that progress have been if people didn't make sacrifices so that I could be here?
I want to thank Dawn Porter for speaking with me. Her 4-part series, Bobby Kennedy for President, is now streaming on Netflix. This interview was recorded in Montclair, New Jersey. If you're a frequent listener, you've probably heard me mention Montclair before, but I need to set the record straight about this town as it relates to Dawn. I moved here 7 years ago with my wife, Rafaela, to help start the Montclair Film Festival. We were coming from Manhattan, only 12 miles away, but we had a lot to learn about the suburbs. Dawn was a longtime Montclair resident and a great friend in our transition. Then 2 years ago, her family relocated to San Francisco for her husband's work. Now she has a beef with me about Montclair.
People ask me if I live in Tom Powers' town, which irritates me to no end. So if you want to irritate me, ask me if I live in Tom Powers' town of Montclair, New Jersey.
Okay, I'm just getting it right out here. Now, Dawn was in Montclair before I was.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope everyone remembers that. Like for a long time before you were. Like
a long
11
time.
years.
I haven't even clocked that much time here. Montclair Film is now led by Executive Director Tom Hall and operates year-round screenings and classes. I'm pleased to serve on its advisory board. For more information, go to montclairfilm.org. Thanks to our team. Series producer, Sarah Modo. Sound mixer, Tom Micah. And web designer, Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. I invite you to listen to our short-form podcast, Documentary of the Week from WNYC. You'll find over 160 documentary recommendations. Pure Nonfiction is distributed by the TIFF Podcast Network. You can read our show notes, learn about live events, and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.